Good morning from this incredibly hot day in Corning. It's kind of like Malaysia today. It's incredibly humid and it's about 92 degrees. I hope it's more comfortable where you are. It's probably not. But anyway, welcome to this live broadcast from the Corning Museum of Glass, specifically the studio. We're across the parking lot from the main building, and we're the teaching facility for hands-on glass skills to be learned by people who intend to apply things to artistic purposes. I thought today it might be neat to look at some unusual ways of making goblets. And glass goblets have been made a long time. Egyptians made glass goblets well before glass blowing, and they used a core forming process. And their goblets, some of them had stems and feet. And when glass blowing came around and was practiced by the Romans in the first 2 or 3 centuries AD, they too made goblets by glass blowing. These days, the studio glass movement has been very heavily affected by goblet making, because a lot of people in studio glass use the making of goblets as a means of developing technique, skills, to enable them to make whatever they want to make. And since the late 70s, early 80s, when Venetians came over, like Lino Tagliapietra, before Johnny Soso, Keiko Ongaro, and showed studio glass artists of the time techniques, one of the things they showed them was goblets. And a goblet is pretty much the hardest thing to make at the furnace. So if you're comfortable making goblets, it makes everything else easier. Whether you like goblets or not, or have any intention of making them, they're a great test of skill and a great way to develop skill. And again, the focus has been on Venetian techniques because of these visitors from Venice who've shared so generously with Americans and people from other countries over the last 30 or 40 years. Venetian goblets were made from, let's say, roughly 1500 through the 18th century, and then they were made again in the 19th and 20th century. But during this time, goblets could have this rather Gothic look. This is something that could have been made around 1500, maybe 1525. Oh, I made these replicas, so these are not museum pieces that I have over this concrete floor. But anyway, this could be from about 1500. This may be 50 or 75 years later. It's very elegant, very simple, very difficult to make, because the less there is to hide behind, the more your technique is really shown. And then in the later 17th century, the early 18th century, Venetians were making incredibly complicated goblets, including even flame-worked elements. These little flowers were made by flame working. And as I said before, there's nothing more difficult, so it makes everything else easier. And one of my early students in the mid-'80s in New York was Deborah Teresco, the woman who wound up winning the first season of the show Blown Away. And Deborah studied with me for 3 or 4 years back in the mid-'80s. And as a thank you, she gave me this goblet. So this was made by Deborah Teresco in about, let's see, there's a date here someplace. New York City, 1984. So it's a beautiful goblet. It uses traditional Venetian techniques of the late 17th, early 18th century. So she made the cup, she made the foot. It's a jester goblet. Here's the box, here's the jester. And then she made the stem and stuck them together with bits of hot glass called glue bits. And since she was able to make this, pretty much anything is easy for Deborah. So it's a really nice way to develop skill and develop a real control of the material. Well, these days, goblets are made very differently. And by these days, I mean like goblets you buy in stores that you use, like Baccarat goblets, Riedel goblets, goblets you buy in Walmart or Kmart or whatever. They are typically blown into molds. The cup is blown into a mold. And in the process of blowing it into the mold, there is what's called an overblow above the present rim, where it was connected to the blowpipe. Then the stem is added, then the foot's added, and it's broken off the blowpipe and annealed, slowly cooled. And so the rim is formed by the process we call cracking off. And it's a really old process. It starts right at the beginning of glass blowing in the first decades of the 1st century AD. Romans were using the cracking off method to make rims on glasses really quickly. That's one kind of rim. The other kind of rim is what we call a furnace finished rim. And this is a goblet that was given to me many years ago. It's a typical later 18th century French goblet, and it has a furnace opened rim. So I thought it would be good to get really clear, if you're not, about the difference between a cracked off rim and a furnace finished rim. And then what we're going to do to prepare us for looking at unusual goblets, goblet techniques, we need to know what's normal. So we're going to look at some of the traditional common techniques for making goblets. So right now we're going to focus on the difference between a cracked off rim and a furnace opened rim. Okay? So this is a replica of one of the pieces in our museum. It's called the Gladiator beaker, and it was blown into a full-size blow mold that was made by a friend of mine in England, a fellow named David Hill, who's magnificently skilled at making molds. And what I did was I dropped a bubble of molten glass into this closed mold, blew really hard. It took on all the decoration. It achieved the final shape and size. And as soon as the glass was hard, we opened the mold and broke it off the blowpipe. You can see that rough break, and cooled it slowly and annealed it. And the rim is formed by cracking off. So here's another one. I've made a little scratch where I want the rim. I made it with a diamond tool, and I marked it with a little felt tip marker so it's easier to see. And heat is applied at the circumference where you want the crack off. Traditionally, this probably was done with a thread of molten glass, a thread of hot glass. These days, people use a little torch. So I'm going to heat the circumference right where this scratch is. And because you're watching, it's probably not going to work. But usually it works. So let's cross our collective fingers. And say something positive to the cracking off deities. And maybe it'll break. Well, it's not going to break. Oh, there it goes. Look at that. Finally. See, just the moment I say it's not going to work, it's out to get me, I know. Anyway, it cracks off. This can be hot. It cracks off, leaving the rim. And this has to be cold worked. Usually it's ground flat. It's polished on the edges because it's super sharp. And ultimately it can be fire polished. Anyway, that's cracking off. And the Venetians virtually never cracked off rims, really until the 1980s. There was a maker named Carlo Moretti who had the idea of cracking off rims. And I think it was very scandalous in Murano, but he became commercially very successful and made terrifically interesting goblets. Anyway, that's a cracked off rim. Let's look at a furnace opened rim. And there are a couple of things you can do making a furnace opened rim that you can't do with cracking off. You can make a lip wrap. You can, at the completion of the making of, say, a tumbler, you can lower it onto what we call a fin mold to make the object octagonal or hexagonal. All sorts of things you can do to shape the rim, and you can't do that when it's furnace opened rim. Sorry, you can't do that when it's a cracked off rim. So I'm going to gather glass on the end of the blowpipe. My pot is kind of low, so I'm going to take what I call a coating gather, wait a moment for the glass to set up a little bit, and I'll take a collecting gather. And before I blow the bubble out, I need to get this shape nice and tidy and under control. So I'm going to use the marver to roll the glass back and forth and create a nice cylindrical shape so that when the bubble comes out, the walls of the bubble will be even. I don't want a thick side and a thin side. That would be disastrous. And now it's good and tidy. I'll blow gently at first. And there's my bubble. I'm going to keep the tip really thick, and I'm going to marver it to a point and cool it somewhat before I reheat it, and then blow it out to full size. Now for this mold, this fin mold to work, I have to have the bottom of the cup just the right diameter. And so you'll see me using calipers to check that diameter occasionally. And I'm going to use a technique I call blow, yank, blow. It's a very sophisticated Venetian technique for quickly creating something tall and thin. You can see the glass getting nice and hot, soft now. And I'm going to marver the tip again on the right arm of the bench. I pull out a little bit, begin a constriction near the blowpipe. And the rubber hose in my mouth replaces an assistant at the end of the bench blowing when I ask for air pressure. So now I'm going to taper this a little bit to begin to get the lower part to the right diameter. And the next thing to do is to flatten the bottom. I'll put the punty in now so that it will be ready when I need it. And there is, oh, look at that. I have done this before. Diameter is just right, so now I'll transfer it to the punty. Before I do that, I'm going to blow on the spot where I put the punty. I want it to stick well enough to hold the object during its completion, but I don't want it to stick terribly well and damage the bottom of the vessel when I break the punty away. So I blow on it just before I put it on, and put it on, press it on, and now I take the tips of the pincers, and right where that constriction is narrowest, I hold it and tap, and it breaks right there. We're now in the phase of the process that I call the opening process. I just put a little bit of glass on the end of a metal rod in the furnace to get its tip soft. This is going to be the lip wrap. And the color is soft, so I can touch it to the edge and pull it off and wrap it around the edge. That's called a lip wrap or an edge wrap. I'm going to open this hole to the diameter of about an inch and a quarter or so. And I could open the entire thing to a conical shape, just doing it that way. But a much more elegant way of shaping the glass is to use air pressure. And I use this tool called the Soffietta that translates roughly to little puffer. And I'm going to soften the glass and blow immediately and shape the glass with air pressure. Now I'll open it to the shape of a slightly conical vessel. Do that again. The glass is really thin, and when it's really thin, it cools quickly, so it's necessary to reheat very frequently. The thinner the glass is, the more frequently we have to reheat. So there's more or less a slightly conical vessel. Now I'm going to get the whole thing slightly soft. I'm going to do that by going in deep for about 4 or 5 seconds, coming out for about 2 seconds, and I'll do that 3 or so times, and then I'm going to lower this onto the fin mold. And here we go to the fin mold. And that's a kind of a magical transformation from something that's round to something that's hexagonal, octagonal. And you can't do that with the cracking off process. You can't do the lip wrap, you can't do the fin mold. So those are two things that give the furnace glassblower who works in the Venetian style a great advantage over the more northern techniques that don't permit that. So furnace finished rim versus a cracked off rim. Now Venetians and people earlier, wasn't just Venetians, but there are two basic ways to build a goblet. The first way, I call it building a goblet on the blowpipe. So I'll explain it as I go. This is the old-fashioned way. In the Renaissance, for example, up until the late 17th century, up until the 1675, say, until roughly 1675, goblets were always built this way. They gathered glass, blew a bubble, and I think just to give you something different to look at, I'm going to use optic molding for this, so I'm going to blow the bubble into this middle dip mold or optic mold. And this will give it a nice texture. There are the ribs. And I could keep the ribs straight, or I could hold the end and twist the pipe to twist the ribs, and I think I'll do that. So I'm going to pull a little bit and twist. And again, this is going to be the cup of the goblet. This will just be a simple little thing. Instead of making a tall stem, I'm going to make a little decorative ball called a knop. And it too will be optic molded. First, I'm going to shape the lower part of the bowl a little bit and set a taper and make the end nice and round. Now I could put the little decorative ball directly on here, and sometimes, rarely, they did that. But more commonly, more often, they would put a little bit of glass on the end of the cup and use the tools to shape it to become what we call a merese, M-E-R-E-S-E. So here's the little bit of glass. I flatten it, make it slightly conical, make a groove near its attachment point, and I put a blade on either side and squeeze, and that makes that nice thing we call the merese. And it's conical. You might have noticed that the end of the thing is conical, and that is entirely functional, because the next thing I'm going to add is this little decorative ball. And because the end of the merese is conical, it's going to be easy to place this right on center. God, I shouldn't say that. It's probably going to go on ridiculously badly. There's the bubble. Now I go into the 12 rib optic mold or dip mold. There's the bubble. I'm going to make a little constriction so that it will bend easily. And that sticks very nicely, and it makes a pretty good strong join. I'll trim the little knop. Traditionally, these have the shape not of a sphere, but of an oblate spheroid. They're bigger around at the equator than from pole to pole. So I'm going to trim this excess off. All I want is the little ball. And now I'll make another merese. The whole time I'm building this, I have to be really careful to keep all of this way above 1,000 Fahrenheit. Otherwise, it can begin to crack. There's another bit for another merese. And I'll add one more bubble, and that will be for what we call a blown foot. This foot will be made from a third bubble of glass. So I put the pipe up, I put the cup up, the goblet up, gather a little marver. It's essential that the glass be really well centered. I'm going to give this a flash. I blow the bubble out and elongate it. And put this back up. And I'm going to give it just a little bit more heat before I go in the middle optic mold. That's where I get the twist. To create a hole in the end of the bubble, I make a constriction, grab it with this tool, and then knock off the excess. And that leaves the little hole that I will dilate, and that'll become the rim of the foot. And I'll open this hole to the diameter of about, an inch or so. And in preparation for opening it and forming the foot, I'm going to use the Sophietta again to reshape this bubble so that it's a nice oblate spheroid. It'll be much easier to open to the shape of a foot from that bubble shape. I just blew on the knob to cool it because during these reheats the knob gets exceedingly hot and soft, so it's important to occasionally cool the knob. That's a flash for the opening of the vessel. Soon I'll break it off the blowpipe and transfer it to the punty, and the shoulder needs to be, at least 1,000 Fahrenheit. Here's the foot shaping taking place. I'm going to cool the spot where the punty is going to go. One of the hardest things about furnace glass blowing is managing the punty and its attachment, because as I said before, you want it strong enough to survive the process of finishing the goblet, but at the end of the process it should break away easily. And now I'll transfer it to the punty. Tips in the crevice and a little tap breaks very nicely. And this is the last part of the process. This is opening the cup. And so far, we're probably 10 minutes into this. It's laborious, it's difficult. It's really easy to lose the object at this very last stage. So it's pretty high stakes for someone who's making a living making goblets, because the hardest part comes right at the end. The opening process. So you can have all that investment in time and glass. The glass isn't worth much, but all that investment in time and lose it right at the end. And I should stop saying that. So I've opened it to about an inch, inch and a quarter. Again, I'll use the Sophietta to reshape the shoulder. So there's a kind of cute little goblet that takes about 12 minutes or so to make. It's very difficult. You've got all the hardest parts of glass blowing wrapped up in this process. And this has to cool slowly, so I'll put it in the annealing oven. I'll break it off so that you can see it come off. I'll tap the rod, and right at the attachment point, it breaks. That is building a goblet on the blowpipe, and that's the way it was done up until the late 17th century, let's say 1685 or so. So this French goblet that I showed you before, that was built that way. So they made the cup, they put a little bit on for that little ball, they added a stem that was blown in a different kind of optic mold to create those facets, and then they added the foot, and this foot has a folded rim. And that was the process. Now, the way Deborah made this is the other basic Venetian way of making a goblet, and that is she pre-made the parts, assembled them using little bits of hot glass that we call glue bits. And I can't tell you the number of glass historians that think that somehow glue bits, hot glass, are like animal hide glue, and it's done hot with this strange glue that actually withstands 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's another story. So what I've got in this pickup box is, I'll show you. I need to do this quickly. So I've made the top, I've made the bottom. They're right there. And what I'm going to do is make a real quick, kind of neat stem. This is after an object in our museum, probably late 17th century, maybe even early 18th century. And it's made this way. So here we go. So what I'm making now is the stem, and once I finish the stem, I'll stick it all together with glue bits. There's a nasty little bubble. I'll pick that out. This is going to be a very quick stem. I'll blow a bubble. And this is going to go in the middle optic mold or dip mold. Same thing, dip mold, optic mold. It's going to go in the middle one. And right now the bubble is a little bit too stout for that. So I'm going to marver it first and taper it so that the bubble will fit all the way to the bottom of the mold. And here we go, to the optic mold. Blow hard, and there are the ribs. I want the ribs twisted, so I grab the end, pull and twist, and now I'm going to take this little metal mandrel and wrap the stem around that. Here's a constriction where this will eventually break off the blowpipe. Now I'm going to reheat this and wrap that spirally thing around the little stem that's near the blowpipe. It begins to shape itself with gravity. And now I'll just hold it and wrap it around. I'll do that one more time. tuck that in. I'm going to add a teeny bit of glass to the bottom of this after I straighten it up. I'm going to add a little bit of glass to the bottom of this so there'll be a little landing pad for the glue bit that I'm going to use to join this to the foot. So I put a little bit of glass right on the center. This is called casting off. You see the thin thread melt away from the hot glass. And I'm going to flatten that, give it some decorative little toolings. And the next thing I'm going to do is put a little bit of glass on the bottom of this, the glue bit, and I'm going to pick up the foot. So here's the glue bit. And now to the pickup box. So I put it right on top, smush them together. I'm going to put the punty in so that it will be ready when I need it. And I need to make sure that this is all well above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but I need to wait and give enough time to the little glue bit for it to cool off, get to like 1,000 Fahrenheit, so that it will be stiff. And I think that's about ready. It just barely moves now. So I'm going to transfer this to the punty. Give it a flash. Just before I do that, transfer to the punty. Tips in the crevice and that'll break. In the remote chance that someone watching has never seen glass blowing, this is unusual that I'm doing it solo. Usually furnace glass blowing is done with 2 or 3 people. Flame working, the business of sitting at a torch and bringing glass tubing and rod into a flame to shape it, that's normally done with 1 person. But I was a flame worker for years before I started furnace working. And for various reasons, for me, this is a very comfortable, natural way to work. But it's important to understand that this is probably not historically accurate. Now I need to trim this off, so I bite, and I'm going to tap that right there. And now I want to make sure that's got a little bit of glass on it to have the cup sit on. There's the bit. I'm going to cast off the thin thread. And I think I'll just go right to the cup. That'll work just fine for picking up the cup. I just gave it a big flash deep in the furnace to try to get everything the same temperature. I'm just working on the alignment now, and that's pretty much it. So this is building a goblet from prefabricated parts. I made the cup, I made the foot assembly, kept them on hold in the pickup oven, we call it. The Venetians use something they call a garage, where they park parts of goblets to keep them hot. And then I made the stem, and there's the glue bit I used for the joining of the foot to the stem, and there's the glue bit for joining the cup. And this is a perfectly legitimate Venetian technique dating from the late 17th century. And I'm going to break that off into the annealer. I'll do it right there. Little bitty tap, 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 tap. Breaks really easily. And if you don't happen to know what annealing is, it's the slow cooling of a goblet, of an object, so that the thinnest parts and the thickest parts cool at about the same rate. Now I'm going to show you what I think might be the most original, most unusual way of making a goblet. And that is a process that was invented by one maker in the 13th century, probably working in France, northern France. And it is a way of making a goblet out of parts. So I've already made the cup. It's in that pickup box. You may have seen it on the right. And what I'm making now is the foot. So I go in the optic mold, blow, and whereas the cup ribs are straight, the foot has twisted ribs. So here comes the twist. For glass blowers watching, this is going to be incredibly confusing because the constriction that I'm making out there is actually going to be the rim of the goblet, the rim of the foot. So just like before, I'm going to hold this and break off the excess, and that will leave a hole that I'll dilate, and that'll become the rim of the goblet. I'll open this to the diameter of about 1.5 inches. And after I re-soften it, I'll blow the foot bubble bigger with the Soffietta. Again, this is going to become the rim of the foot. So I'm going to heat this and flare the rim. This is, as I said, from the 13th century. It's a very Gothic, maybe medieval looking goblet. I'll show you a picture of the original when I finish. It has a sort of an ecclesiastical look. The foot's a lot bigger than you might think appropriate. It looks like something that might be used in the church service. So there's the foot. And I'm going to put a punty right in there. And I'm making the punty sort of large diameter so that it doesn't go into this little cavity. I want the punty to sit just outside that cavity. So I flatten it, and hopefully the edge of this, yeah, that worked. The edge of this will keep the soft glass from going up in the little hole. Yeah. Now you remember the glue bits from the previous piece. Well, this is effectively going to be a glue bit, but it's going to be very different in shape. Now I'm going to turn this fan off because I don't want it to crack the thin glass. And also, as I mentioned before, the cup is in that pickup box at 920 degrees Fahrenheit. I might have to touch the cup with tweezers, and if I do, I want the tweezers to be hot, so I preheat the tweezers. Otherwise, they'd crack the cup. And I'm going to make sure the foot's straight. It is. I'm going to put a little bit of glass on the end of this. Here we go. And that looks like any old glue bit, but when I finish the piece, it's not going to look like a glue bit at all. And so here we go to the pickup box. I touch this, and for a Venetian glue bit, I would simply press them together. But for this goblet, the stem is formed just by letting the thing hang. And it's about 900 degrees in there, so it's not exactly room temperature, so the glass sets up very gradually. And there it is. Maybe the most original, unusual way of making a goblet conceived up until the 20th century. And I think it probably was invented by one glassblower, and I think it probably died with him. Here's the original. It's got a great story in that this goblet was unknown until 1948. And it was in a church in northern France, Rouen. And it was an important industrial city. It was bombed in World War II. And in about 1948, they were cleaning up that part of the city. They had to tear down this church, St. Augustine. And as they were tearing it down, the workers found a void in one of the walls. And fortunately, they stopped work, looked at it, and they found this goblet. And it was a tradition, it turns out, in the 13th century in that part of France for stonemasons, upon finishing a building, to wall up a glass of wine. So amazingly, these workers, however many hundred years later, found this glass of, obviously it was dried up, there wasn't wine in it, but found this goblet. And all through my youth, this was a goblet that appeared in books because it was the only really, really beautiful medieval glass object. And it was thought to be unique. And then more showed up, especially when they excavated the courtyard of the Louvre in Paris to put in the IMP new pyramid thing. They found more objects like this, so it's not absolutely unique anymore. But St. Augustine, Rouen, very interesting process. And the interesting thing, as I mentioned, maybe it's not a process that has been exceeded in creativity till the 20th century. The Venetians started around 1910 making things like this, exact same process, except they manipulated the stems, and made them a little funny and artistic. Process is exactly the same. These were done around 1895 to about 1910. These were actually showed in an exposition in 1895. So it was going to be another half century before this goblet was discovered. So this is a completely independent discovery of this because nobody knew of this St. Augustine Rouen goblet. I'm going to ask our monitors now, are there any questions that I might answer? I know you're out there live. No? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, we don't have much time left, but I thought I'd show you a really interesting, similarly original technique. Sometime in the 17th century in Spain, some glassblower came up with the idea of combining the stem and foot from one bubble. So you saw me make a blown foot for that goblet built on the blowpipe, and you saw me make the knob. Well, it turns out you can take one bubble, divide it in two, and pull out to form the stem, and then the larger part hanging off the end, the bubble, can be used to make the foot. And we don't have time to make the whole thing, but I thought I'd just show you that procedure because it is strikingly original. And like the St. Augustin Rouen goblet, I think it came and went with one glassblower's career. We don't have too many of these. I think I'll make the cup. There's the bit that's going to become the cup. Sorry, the gather that's going to become the cup. This is a variation on building a goblet on the blowpipe. So what I'm making right now is the cup. This is one version of the goblet. There are, half a dozen different varieties of cup shapes on these kind of amazing one-piece stem foot constructions. Next, I'm going to put a maurice with a nice conical face on the end of this. This will be the blowpipe for the bubble that will be both the stem and the foot. I'm going to give this a flash before I lower the bubble onto it. There's the bubble. And the first constriction I make will be to articulate the difference between the stem and the foot. So now I've established that, I pull out to form the stem. So there's the stem with its foot bubble hanging off the end. Now I need to make a constriction so that I can create a hole in the end of the foot bubble. And I'll give it a flash before I do this. There we go. I didn't want it to crack in front of you. Here's the hole in the end of the foot bubble. And there's a little technical problem coming up ahead that they had to solve, and they did it in a really neat way. I won't give it away, I'll show you as I do it. Normally one opens a foot to be the shape of a sort of an exponential curve. It almost gets flat, not quite. But this one, I'm going to open flat. I'm going to try to get the foot bubble hot without getting the stem too hot because I want to soffietta it. So I'm going to chill the stem. Straighten the stem. Now I'll heat the foot bubble and open it. And you may see the problem that's coming. Because this is all from one bubble, the stem is going to be open to the foot. And if it stays open, there are two problems. One is it'll collect crud, it'll get dirt in it that could never be cleaned out. And the other thing is I have to punty this to open the cup, and there's nothing to put the punty on. So I open the foot not only flat, but slightly negative. And then, and the originals all have this, of course. Then I put a little bit of glass on the end. And it's a little plug. So that seals the stem, and it's also something for the punty to sit on. I'll put the punty in now. Now the foot needs to be reshaped, so I'm going to gently heat the foot, re-soften it, and then get rid of that negative curve. Make the edge flat. Cool the spot where I'm going to put the punty. And I'll give it another flash. I think I'm going to do that again. I'll cool that punty site again. The deep flash, of course, is to keep that hot, because that has to be well above 1,000 or it'll begin to crack. Now the transfer to the punty. Wow, that was bad aim. I think that was Brad, our camera person's fault. He was kind of in my way. A little further back, please, Brad. You're, no, I'm just kidding. Now, the goblet that I showed you has this big flared top, and you might think, gosh, how could you possibly drink from that? It was very common in the Renaissance to have very flat openings of goblets. This is nothing unusual. We have paintings of people drinking from them, so we know they were actually functional. So I'm going to create this big flare thing by using the soffietta to reshape the glass. I'll open the hole to about 1 inch.
I've got a question for you, Bill.
Yes, Amanda.
Doesn't sealing the bubble like that risk inflating it?
That's an interesting question. Doesn't sealing the bubble, like I just did with that bit, risk inflating it? If I sealed it when it was really chilly, if I had sealed it when the bubble was really chilly, it would have blown up. But I was really careful to seal it when the stem was very hot. And in doing that, right now, with the stem very hot and maybe even slightly soft, inside is atmospheric pressure. So it's neither going to blow up nor is it going to suck in like that. So I didn't mention it, but I was careful to have the stem really, really hot when I did that. Great question. It's a very insider glassblower kind of question. This has a rather large inner fold. Maybe I didn't blow that up big enough. Do that again. I show this process in my second ebook, The Techniques of Renaissance Venetian Style Glass Blowing. And if you want to see that, it's free, available all the time on the Corning Museum of Glass website. The Techniques of Renaissance Venetian Style Glass Blowing. This is my Spanish example. So there's the inner folded lip. I'll make sure that it touches all around. And I'm going to begin this flare with the jacks, with the tools I've been using. So I want to make this slightly conical at this point. I'm going to do that one more time. And I'll finish it by spinning it when the glass is soft and use centrifugal force, what most of us call centrifugal force. The physicists who've studied with me all say it's centripetal acceleration, but not to put too fine a point on that, they assure me there's no centrifugal force. Anyway, the glass softens, you spin, and you get that. And that can be adjusted to any angle just by gently touching it with the jacks. So combination stem and foot from one bubble. Again, I think it was the invention of one glass blower. Didn't last long, so I suspect it just was done the duration of his career. I say his because in that period, glass blowers were male. And the break off in the annealer. We started this a little bit late, so I assume it was okay to go a little bit late. And there's our hull, including in the very back, if you would, the octagonal tumbler. Well, this could go on for probably about 2 hours because there are many oddities in the making of goblets through the centuries. So we've just scratched the surface. I hope you enjoyed it. We keep these monitored, so if you have questions later on, like in a week or a month, ask away. I'll see it eventually and get back to you. And thanks so much for watching. And I thank Brad and the tech team for making this possible, and Richard and Amanda. And do watch for our next live stream that I believe will be next Wednesday. Is that correct? Yeah, not next Wednesday, but the Wednesday after. Okay, thanks so much for watching. Enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Take care. Bye.